How has the medication been going? Fine, I guess. Only been, what, 3 weeks? Something like that. Have you noticed any side effects? I recall you being concerned about not drinking. I still had a few beers this weekend. My friend and I got together and we were having fun. Only beer, though. No vodka. Not ideal, but it's something, I guess. Aside from that, nothing. Well, actually, that's not true. My libido's been shot, but whatever. Not like I was using that much anyways. Okay, so, no changes in your mood yet. That's not uncommon this early on. I wanted to ask about what we talked about. I can't remember if it was before or after you started the medication. Anyway, I wanted to ask about how your thoughts have been. Thoughts? Yes. Have you had any more thoughts of suicide or self-harm? Anything of that nature lately? Barlow? Hello, everybody. I hope you're all doing well. You may be wondering why the approach of this video is somewhat different in comparison to my previous ones, but I'll explain the reasoning behind that later. But, let me assure you that the focus of this video will still be on the character at hand. But before we get to him, hello! My name is Barlow, and I'm a licensed mental health counselor. I've been conducting therapy for several years now, and, if you'd like to know more about my role, there will be a link to an article in the description below. There will also be links to informational articles pertaining to the topics that I discuss during this video. Now, there's a lot of material to cover, so let's get started. Burrows is a visual novel by Captain Nico. The protagonist, who is the subject of this video, is named Grayson... Huh. That's interesting. Grayson Barlow, or Gray as he prefers to be called, is not doing well at the start of the game's story. To give a brief overview of his personal history, Gray grew up in a wealthy family, but has since turned his back on both his familial name and estate. Doing so resulted in Gray facing a great deal of difficulties, both with housing and his own finances. In fact, we learn that Gray resided in homeless encampments for some time after initially distancing himself from his family. Gray has since begun trying to make ends meet by performing whatever odd jobs he can around New Orleans in an effort to pay for his portion of rent. However, financial stability continues to be a source of stress for him, as we see that he sometimes struggles to pay for food. Gray's financial difficulties became so severe that, at one point, he engaged in sex work, something that he appears to have not desired to perform, but was compelled to do so due to dire circumstances. Now, returning to the beginning of Burrows, we see Gray walking through the streets of New Orleans. As it rains, Gray contemplates his personal relationships up until this point, and the difficulties that he has faced. It is here that we learn Gray is walking toward the woods outside of town, where he plans to commit suicide. The player is even given a copy of Gray's suicide note, which both confirms that he is suicidal in this moment, and grants us insight into his current outlook on the state of his life. It can be found in the game's Fragments section, which contains supplementary materials that provide additional context for characters and the events of the plot. In the suicide note, Gray claims to have been a terrible friend, even calling himself a burden to those around him. He apologizes to his two friends, Simone and Etienne, as well as his landlord, John. He ends the note saying he loves them all. But, during his walk through New Orleans, Gray stops at a bar. He does so due to believing that being intoxicated will make committing suicide easier. It is here when Gray meets the main antagonist of the visual novel, Virgil. After spending some time at the bar, Gray is sent to an unknown location, where time doesn't pass. Gray refers to this place as the Golden Place, and, while there, he encounters 4 men, each of whom have also been brought to the Golden Place for unknown reasons. While in the Golden Place, Gray gets to know each of the game's 4 route characters, Mark, Ken, Gabe, and Hero. Afterward, Gray is forced to make a choice, being told that he can only save one of his new friends. It is here where the story diverges into 4 distinct plotlines, each of which challenges Gray and gives the reader unique insights into his personal issues. Now, due to the structure of this video, I feel as though it's important that I give brief overviews of each of these 4 plotlines. I hope that by providing such overviews, greater context will be added to the specific examples I will be reviewing in multiple sections of this video. First, there's Mark. Mark is living in New York City during the 1960s. While spending time with Mark, Gray becomes increasingly concerned about Mark's perplexing behavior, which sometimes manifests in the form of verbal aggression. Gray often doesn't know what Mark's intentions are, and his confusion of the situation only worsens, as New York City, sometimes, turns into a nightmarish version of itself. Secondly, there's Ken, who is currently on the run from the law for reasons unknown, and is attempting to flee across 1950s Midwest America. Much like Mark, he sometimes treats Gray with animosity, doing so particularly in regard to Gray's sexuality. Things are further complicated as both Gray and Ken begin traveling with 2 bikers named Jesse and Colt, neither of whom maintain positive opinions of Ken. Thirdly, we have Gabe. Gabe is currently attending college in the 1980s and is on the swim team of his school. However, his family is unaware of his sexual orientation, and his friends often bully him in regard to his weight, even going so far as to give him the nickname Chug. Finally, we have the bestest boy, the most special man of them all, the brightest, handsomest, sexiest 40-year-old man. I know what I'm about, people. Hiro is a Japanese immigrant currently living in 1890s Germany. He's attempting to prove his worth as an engineer, but is struggling to do so, as he has only received his current job of building Zeppelins by agreeing to a significant pay cut. He did so due to the reluctance of his superiors to hire a Japanese immigrant. Again, these are very broad summaries that don't contain spoilers, but I hope that keeping them in mind will provide context to some of the scenes I will be discussing in my analysis of Gray. Now, before attending an intake therapy session with a therapist, a new client will complete multiple pieces of paperwork, including what's known as an intake form. An intake form poses several inquiries in regard to a client's mental health history and their motivation for seeking treatment in the present. Like with my other videos, I'm using questions that are specifically relevant to Gray and his presenting issues. The questions are as follows. What was your childhood like? Do you consume recreational drugs and/or alcohol? What is your romantic relationship like? What have you felt in the past 6 months? What are your coping skills? What are your goals for therapy? Usually, a client and a therapist establish the goals referenced in that last question together, but since this isn't a typical therapy environment, I'll be answering it myself and propose how I would approach Gray's overall psychological treatment. Before the video goes any further, as usual, I wish to give a spoiler warning. In order to analyze Gray, I will be examining information from all of the different routes. So, if you haven't read the 4 routes of Burrows or are not caught up with the most recent updates, now is the time to do so. And now, for one last time, let's dig a little deeper. Overall, Gray seems to have had positive experiences with the older women of his family, specifically his grandmother and mother. Gray's grandmother appears to have suffered from an undefined mental health issue, which involved her experiencing both auditory and visual hallucinations. Despite this, Gray says he was able to bond with his grandmother during his childhood. This appears to stem from the fact that Grandma often told the young Gray stories of Ireland before he fell asleep. Unfortunately, Gray's grandmother was institutionalized at one point and died while he was still young, so much of her personality and her psychological issues are currently undefined. However, Gray can be seen contemplating the impact she had on him across multiple routes, seemingly still feeling a great deal of fondness for her as a person and sadness toward her institutionalization. Unfortunately, we also only receive minimal information in regard to Gray's mother. Yet, what we do know is that she was considered to be a wild woman by Gray's father. We also learn that Gray trusted her so much that, during his youth, he revealed his romantic interest in another boy to her. Not only did Gray's mother accept him, but she also encouraged him, even giving Gray advice on how to express such interest in this other boy in an effective manner. Unfortunately, despite Grandma and Mom being supportive, warm figures for Gray, the same cannot be said of Gray's father. Gray's father was the sole earner of income for the family, obtaining money through his business ventures of mining and metalwork. We also learn that he has provided materials to the production of Zeppelins in Germany during the end of the 1800s. Gray appears to maintain feelings of animosity toward his father. The most apparent reason for such animosity is the bigoted views Gray's father maintains regarding certain races. In addition to denying his wife's Irish heritage, Gray's father utilized a pseudoscience known as Phrenology in an effort to prove he belonged to a supposedly superior race. Such racist views appear to persist in his later years, as Gray witnesses his father attending what appears to be a Ku Klux Klan rally late into Ken's route. This racism, as well as Gray learning that his family's estate was obtained through owning slaves, appears to have contributed to Gray deciding to abandon his family home upon reaching adulthood. We know this due to a conversation during Mark's route, when Gray explicitly tells Mark, quote, "I realized our livelihood was only possible because my grandfather owned cattle as slaves. Everything I used to think was beautiful suddenly looked dirty, corrupted," end quote. At some point, Gray's relationship with his father and his overall family appeared to become strained as he attempted to verbalize criticisms toward how the family obtained its large wealth. It's also worth noting that Gray was once close to his older sister, Jules. However, the pair appear to be no longer close. This may possibly be due to the fact that Gray took issue with his family's racist history, as, during Hero's route, we see Gray suspect that his sister desired to marry another possum in an effort to keep the family line pure. Now, focusing on the conversation about family with Mark, we also learn that Gray's father attempted to pressure Gray into marrying the daughter of an oil baron. Gray describes this conflict by saying, quote, "Nobody in the family would listen. They were too concerned with our reputation. They were worried I would cause a big stink. go against the politics of our conglomerates. So my father's solution was to force me to marry the daughter of an oil baron. He threatened to cut me off completely if I didn't." End quote. After this, Gray proceeds to say that this marriage was only formed by his father to help the company merger. This, as well as Gray's familial history, appear to be why Gray never wants to have children. Gray himself makes remarks that indicate a desire to not continue his family bloodline, both in this conversation with Mark and a conversation during Ken's route. Overall, Gray seems to have received a great deal of love and support from his mother and grandmother during childhood. But, once his grandmother was institutionalized and his mother passed, very little support or comfort were left for Gray. He was left to argue with a cold and racist father, as well as a sister who appears to have chosen the family name over her own brother. Unfortunately, Gray's grandmother and mother weren't the only important people to die during Gray's youth. During Gray's childhood, he had a best friend named Sam, who was the son of a business partner of Gray's father. As a child, Sam seemed sensitive and shy. However, Gray appears to have attempted to encourage Sam to get out of his comfort zone, such as encouraging Sam to explore the city of New Orleans with him. Gray can even be seen comforting Sam when the young bear becomes upset. While exploring the city of New Orleans, Gray and Sam both met Etienne and Simone, who would later become Gray's romantic partners. But, still focusing on his childhood for now, we see Gray defend Sam from Etienne at one point, going so far as to punch Etienne for insulting Sam. Over time, and during these outings to New Orleans, Gray began developing romantic feelings for not only Etienne, but Simone as well. Neither of these two maintained positive opinions of Sam, especially Simone, due to Sam attempting to both touch her and frequently convince others that she was his girlfriend. Sam and Gray's relationship became further complicated upon Sam confessing romantic feelings for Gray one day when Gray was 13 years old and the two were under a magnolia tree. Gray apologized for not sharing Sam's romantic feelings, but affirmed his platonic love for Sam, even expressing that he still wants to be friends despite this lack of mutual romantic interest. Gray and Sam performed their signature handshake together at Gray's insistence before parting ways. Later that same day, Sam returned to the magnolia tree and hanged himself from one of its branches. Sam's suicide appears to have caused Gray a great deal of emotional distress, even appearing to upset him in the present day after all these years. We learn that such distress was so overwhelming that Gray stopped going into New Orleans to see Simone and Etienne after Sam's death. To further complicate things, Gray appears to experience a significant amount of self-blame in regard to Sam's emotional distress. While I'll further explain Gray's overall experience with self-blame later, his predisposition toward this emotion appears to have first begun with his rejection of Sam's romantic interest. This seems likely upon examining one of the game's fragments, specifically a diary entry written by a 13-year-old Gray on the day of Sam's confession. Gray, upon describing his rejection of Sam, writes, quote, "I know that's not what he wanted to hear. He gave me a long hug and started crying. I wish I were dead." End quote. Gray's self-blame pertaining to Sam is further emphasized in the extra short story titled The Path, in which Gray attends a session with a psychiatrist. During the early portion of this extra short story, Gray says Sam was his best friend. He then proceeds to say, quote, "At least that's how he saw it. I was a pretty terrible friend to him, looking back." End quote. It is worth noting that Gray is 14 years old at the time of this psychiatric appointment, indicating that a significant amount of time has passed since Sam's suicide, as Gray was 13 when that occurred. Unfortunately, the feelings of self-blame, sadness, and frustration that Sam's suicide instilled within Gray still persist, and he's struggling to manage such emotions in a healthy manner. Continuing to focus on the extra short story titled The Path, we see a teenage Gray meeting with a psychiatrist. Again, Gray is 14 here, which appears to indicate that a somewhat significant amount of time has passed since Sam's suicide, which occurred when Gray was 13. Gray seems disconnected during the session, and generally not doing well psychologically, as indicated by his brief responses to the psychiatrist's questions. This continues to appear to be true when the psychiatrist verbally remarks on how he can smell alcohol on Gray, and proceeds to ask if the possum is ashamed. To this, Gray thinks to himself, quote, "Not really. Who cares anymore?" End quote. We also learn that Gray isn't eating consistently, as Gray takes note of a stomach pain he experiences at one point, and thinks to himself, quote, "Maybe it'd hurt less if there was some food in there." End quote. At the end of the session, the psychiatrist provides Gray with a morphine prescription to help him manage the pain of alcohol withdrawal symptoms. He does so before proceeding to tell Gray that his psychiatric treatment is only possible due to the resources Gray's father has access to, going so far as to say that if Gray were anyone else, he'd, quote, "be sent to an asylum to waste away with the other drunks." End quote. Unsurprisingly, Gray starts to cry. We receive a clearer view of Gray's alcohol abuse during his teenage years within Gabe's path. While cuddling together naked in bed, Gabe asks about scars he notices on Gray's back. While Gabe says Gray doesn't have to answer, Gray chooses to do so. Gray first opens up about Sam's suicide, which he then directly links to his own alcohol abuse. He says, quote, "My way of dealing ended at the bottom of a flask." End quote. Gray then proceeds to detail how he would abuse alcohol on multiple occasions throughout the day while hiding in a garden shed on his family's property. He even goes as far as saying how he drank, quote, "whatever I could get my hands on. I blamed myself for the whole thing. So if I ended up destroying myself with my coping method, I figured it'd be karma." End quote. One day, while drinking within the shed, Gray tried to hide while he heard workers approaching and talking about a tool they needed from inside. While intoxicated and afraid of how his father would react to seeing him in such a state, Gray tried to hide behind the door. This resulted in the door hitting Gray and knocking him against a piece of equipment that almost permanently injured his spine. Gray details this injury and his feelings of the lingering scars more explicitly in Ken's route. Much like Gabe, Ken asks about how Gray received the scars on his back. While Ken admires how the scars look, commenting on how tough they make Gray appear, Gray has a very different opinion towards his wounds. Internally, Gray says, quote, "I hate them. It just reminds me of every mistake that led me there." End quote. Even after all of this time, the possum's feelings of self-blame are prominent in regard to how he views his own personal history. Now, while alcohol abuse can be detrimental to one's own physical health, I feel that it's necessary to also touch upon the social and emotional impacts of alcohol abuse. During Hero's route, Gray tries to avoid contemplating his own substance abuse issues prior to attending a pub with Hero. He appears to talk himself into drinking with Hero, focusing on how fun doing so will most likely be. Internally, Gray thinks to himself, quote, "I try to ignore that I failed at sobriety again, and instead focus on how fun it's going to be to see Hero get tipsy," end quote. Now, it's important to note that Hero is worried about the security of his job position as an engineer. This is due to the fact that his superiors have already discriminated against him on the basis of his Japanese identity. While becoming increasingly more and more intoxicated, Gray begins inquiring in regard to Hero's age. Despite Hero dissuading this line of questioning, an intoxicated Gray persists. Eventually, Hero explicitly states that he doesn't want to disclose his age due to his employer's treatment of him, saying, quote, "I don't need any more reasons for employers to see me as less desirable," end quote. And yet, despite this explanation clearly being stated, a drunken Gray proceeds to loudly ask for everyone present in the pub to toast to Hero. Hero asks him to stop, but Gray ignores this and continues to toast. Hero seems very uneasy here and grips Gray's hand under the table. Unfortunately, the crowd is on Gray's side and aid Gray in pressuring Hero into disclosing his age. Again, doing this not only disregards Hero's expressed concern for disclosing his age, but also puts the security of his employment at greater risk. The negative social consequences of Gray's alcohol abuse manifest in a more prominently distressing manner the following morning. Both Hero and Gray awaken to find that neither fully remember the previous night due to how much alcohol they both drank. The two speculate in regard to whether or not they had sex upon returning to Hero's bedroom, and neither are able to provide a definitive answer. Hero says he feels great, states that the pair will be sober the next time they have sex, and expresses that he isn't upset at all. Unfortunately, Gray doesn't behave in such a calm manner, and becomes emotionally volatile. He says that he lost control in regard to his alcohol consumption, appearing to even feel guilt for his behavior the night before. Even though Hero apologizes for not being aware of Gray's history of alcoholism, Gray continues to be distressed. He blames himself for the drunken night, even going so far as to say, quote, "I couldn't live with myself if I hurt you because of it," end quote. We receive a glimpse into how Gray's alcoholism has negatively impacted his past social relationships in Ken's route. If the player chooses to pursue the side characters Jesse and Colt, Gray plays a game of strip poker with the two men one evening. All three consume a large amount of beer before going to bed, and Gray awakens the following morning to find that Jesse and Colt are gone. This results in Gray beginning to catastrophize, and fear that the two men have abandoned him. Gray then reveals that this would not be the first instance in which alcohol harmed his relationships with others, and resulted in a painful following morning. He internally says, quote, "It's not the first time this has happened. You get drunk with a couple of friends, things get too intimate, and the next thing you know, they avoid you like the plague. What's a pleasant memory for you is nothing but embarrassment for them, and they'll deny it happening all the way to the grave." End quote. Gray's relationship with alcohol did not begin on a healthy note, as he was initially using it to cope with the emotional distress he experienced from Sam's suicide. And, while he did maintain sobriety from alcohol for many years, Gray appears to be gradually returning to his former pattern of substance abuse. While doing so isn't ideal, it's understandable as to why he is doing so. From the suicide attempt, to the supernatural events, and the physical danger he has endured, Gray has been trying to bring himself some sense of comfort through drinking. I often tell clients that people tend to be drawn to what's familiar to us. even if what's familiar isn't healthy. There's comfort in the familiar. There's no surprises, and alcohol is no exception. The substance of alcohol in particular can emotionally soothe us in a moment of stress, and even narrow our attention, so we're not worrying about what happened yesterday or what will happen tomorrow. That's what I see when I view Gray's ongoing relapse. He feels hopeless at times and, more importantly, scared. While his drinking appears to be mostly manageable during certain instances, such as when he drinks wine with Mark, it most likely won't remain that way. I'm inclined to believe this due to the previously described scenes in Hero and Ken's routes. Addiction, after all, can typically be a slow burn process, for lack of a better term. However, this slow burn can increase in terms of speed whenever we encounter a significant life change or painful difficulties within our personal relationships. You seem tense, Barlow. Sorry, it's just... talking about it makes me feel like I'm back in that moment. What about her mentioning that you're bi made you so uncomfortable? I don't know. Just... it sounds stupid, but felt like a liar. Like I'd been lying to everyone, and her bringing it up while we were all hanging out was... I don't know. Exposing me? Felt like I was on trial. Just stupid because nobody said anything. The conversation kept going. But still, even talking about it right now is making me feel all that shit again. I just want to hide. Not talk about it, but... still pissed at myself. I was so sure I was gay, but... a life happened, like with anything else. Still, I wish I could have just figured it out sooner. Then I wouldn't have to bring it up with people or have it brought up time and time again. Everything would just be easier. I don't know. I wouldn't feel like a liar. Gray has a complicated history with his own sexual orientation, even appearing to feel ashamed of his attraction toward both men and women at times. I wish to highlight this because it appears to have significantly impacted his most recent romantic relationships with Simone and Etienne. A prominent moment I wish to focus on occurs during Mark's route, when Gray and Mark share their own personal journeys of self-discovery regarding their sexualities. Mark asks when things clicked for Gray. Gray struggles to give a direct answer, initially stating he's still figuring it out, and, at one point, covers his head and drinks more wine as Mark laughs at Gray's attempts to express himself. Gray then becomes hopeful as Mark mentions certain hideaways in New York City, where Gray can possibly learn more about his own identity from other queer people. Gray expresses joy at this possibility, even telling Mark, quote, "For a long time, I thought I was just some deviant, someone who would take whatever they could get. But even knowing there's one place in the world where another person like me could exist gives me hope that I'm not a freak, you know?" End quote. Gray then asks if he can join Mark the next time Mark goes to one of these hideaways, explicitly wanting to find a label that may fit his sexual orientation. Gray then becomes self-conscious and asks if wanting a label so greatly is weird. Mark then proceeds to dismiss the value of finding a suitable label, saying it's not essential and is, quote, "just a word and nothing more," end quote. Unfortunately, seemingly due to the very insecurities he mentioned only moments ago, Gray adopts this opinion, saying he's glad he no longer has to worry about a label. He seemingly gives up on his desire at establishing a clear sense of his own identity, all because of Mark's statements influencing Gray's own insecurities. And so, after Mark is done being Mark, the pair spend the night talking and drinking, having abandoned Gray's desire to better understand himself. And, in abandoning his search for a label, and the potential comfort this might bring, Gray's feelings of shame remain unresolved. In Ken's route, after kissing Colt, Gray reflects upon his own difficulties with not, quote, rushing things, end quote. He then briefly alludes to how this was why he was unable to decline Etienne's advances prior to the beginning of their relationship. We receive a clearer understanding of Gray and Etienne's relationship in Gabe's route, when Gray tries to comfort Gabe. For context, Gabe is upset here and asks why Gray didn't defend him during a distressing encounter with Gabe's friends earlier in the day while the group was playing Dungeons & Dragons. The player is given two dialogue options here, and, if the player chooses the "you need to stick up for yourself" option, Gray opens up about his experiences with dating Etienne. He says, quote, "I was in a bad relationship. There was a lot of abuse. Most of it I didn't even know was abuse until I could look back at it with a fresh perspective." We receive further insight into Gray's relationship with Etienne in Hero's route, when Gray goes to comfort a crying Hero. While the two sit in silence for a few moments, Gray experiences tension in his body and thinks to himself, quote, "I haven't felt like this since me and Et broke up. Those all-night screaming matches that pushed our emotions to their limit. Then, when we finally ran out of energy and gave up on hating each other, we'd embrace and make love like nothing happened. It never felt good, but it was better than feeling nothing." End quote. Returning to Gabe's route, we see this dynamic play out when Etienne arrives in LA, having been transported there by Virgil. Etienne berates the possum, even yelling at one point and causing Gray to flinch. Etienne even goes as far as to criticize Gray for not carrying weapons with him at one point during this conversation. Gray says carrying a weapon makes him anxious, and that he's not like Etienne in that regard. To this, Etienne says, quote, "Yeah, and look where it got you," end quote. Such a statement, in my opinion, goes beyond basic criticism. Due to the yelling, and some of the word choices here, Etienne seems to be harboring resentment towards Gray, which he appears to have no interest in concealing. Now, one could argue that this particular display of aggression is due to 1. Gray and Etienne being ex-boyfriends at this time, or 2. Etienne being angry about Gray's recent suicide attempt. Because of this, I feel it's necessary to reference the extra short story titled Mardi Gras. In this short story, we see Gray and Etienne watching the Mardi Gras parade. At this point in time, the two are dating. Gray experiences guilt for how tired Etienne has been from working, appearing to ruminate on the numerous jobs Etienne has performed and the nights where the Doberman has returned home at a late hour. Etienne tries to assuage Gray's guilt, reminding Gray that Etienne's hard work puts food on the table at the end of the day. And yet, Gray asserts to Etienne that he'll find some work soon and will start being able to financially contribute in a significant way. At the mention of Simone, Gray's guilt becomes more profound as he reflects on how he accepted Etienne's advances while still dating Simone. Etienne discourages this guilt as well, reminding Gray of how pleasurable it felt to hold Gray and to hear the possum express his love for Etienne. He does this while his hands are placed upon Gray's shoulders. It's at this point when Etienne tells Gray, quote, "I want to hear you say it," end quote. He then proceeds to tighten his grip on Gray's body, and Gray obediently affirms his love for Etienne. I highlight this scene because we are given a direct representation of Gray and Etienne's relationship here, as opposed to Gray's own memories pertaining to it. We are able to see their dynamic play out without the pair's relationship being misrepresented by the termination of the relationship, or Etienne's feelings regarding Gray's recent suicide attempt. Gray does possess feelings of love for Etienne. However, such love is complicated by Gray's own feelings of guilt for being unable to financially pull his own weight due to a lack of consistent work. He loves Etienne, but also feels indebted to him. More than that, Gray appears dependent on both Etienne and Simone due to their consistent income. In fact, later in the short story, we learn that Etienne was the reason why Gray was hired to sweep up hair at a local salon, which was only possible due to Etienne convincing them to hire Gray. And then, there's the aspect of physical control, as demonstrated by Etienne tightly gripping Gray and saying he wants to hear Gray say he loves him. Many individuals don't leave abusive relationships for numerous reasons that can vary from situation to situation, one of which is, believe it or not, love. Love is an emotion that typically drives people to enter a romantic relationship in the first place, and the presence of abuse is not always enough to diminish such an emotion. There are also financial reasons, as many people lack the financial resources to depart from their abusive relationships and secure new housing or other important necessities. Finally, there is the issue of guilt. This guilt can stem from items such as social stigmas regarding divorce, or even an abuser possessing a chronic health condition that they require assistance with. While there were abusive aspects of their relationship, items such as guilt, a lack of finances, and love do appear to have played roles in Gray staying with Etienne. When you take all of these factors into consideration, as well as the fact that Gray and Etienne have a history together as childhood friends, it's easy to see why Gray stayed with Etienne for as long as he did. Prior to dating Etienne, Gray was romantically involved with Simone. Much like Etienne, Gray was childhood friends with Simone. It seems as though his feelings of affection towards her, as well as Etienne, began in childhood. Returning to the Path short story, we, the reader, are given insight into Gray's feelings toward both Simone and Etienne. For context, Simone has a supernatural ability that allows her to know the emotions and desires of others. In a section of the short story told from Simone's point of view, we learn via narration from Simone that a young Gray, quote, wants to kiss Etienne, end quote. Now, Gray also appears to maintain some romantic interest in Simone, as Gray emphasizes how pretty Simone's eyes are, and proceeds to kiss her on the nose. Now, returning to the present, we know that Simone and Gray became romantically involved as adults. And, despite Gray's infidelity, Simone chose to remain friends with Gray, seemingly still holding a great deal of care and concern for the possum. However, even in their now platonic relationship status, there are still difficulties that present themselves due to the circumstances surrounding the end of their romantic relationship. Simone, despite claiming otherwise, appears to still be hurt by Gray's infidelity. In the previously described Mardi Gras short story, Simone approaches Etienne and Gray, interrupting the pair's private conversation. Initially, she seems warm, but Gray takes note of how the corner of her mouth twitches as she nods at him before speaking to Etienne. Simone and Gray's history is more prominently displayed in Mark's route, after Simone is transported to New York City by Virgil. If the player prioritizes Simone over Mark, Gray and Simone discuss Gray's romantic interest in Mark. Simone says this is a bad idea, and proceeds to draw parallels between Gray's pursuit of Mark to his relationship with Etienne. However, While reviewing how Gray's relationship with Etienne began, Simone looks away at one point and clears her throat. She then makes a vague statement, saying, quote, "And you made some choices that led to you two being together," end quote. One aspect I want to specifically focus on here, in the Simone path of Mark's route, is her view of Gray. In addition to desiring to help Gray break his pattern of blindly pursuing men with abusive tendencies, Simone tries to help him further develop perspective in regard to how he approaches romantic relationships as a whole. This is demonstrated in a scene further into the Simone path, which depicts both Gray and Simone riding the subway. Gray reveals that he knew Simone was performing the night of his suicide attempt. He confesses to Simone that he wanted to see her perform her songs, but feared that doing so would cause him to reconsider his suicide plan. Gray then proceeds to say that Simone is powerful when it comes to his own emotions. To this, Simone says, quote, "I'm just me, Gray. Stop putting me on a pedestal," end quote. Unfortunately, Gray doesn't abide by this advice and proceeds to say, quote, "I'll stop when you stop deserving it," end quote. This tendency of Gray's, as well as his predisposition to rushing things, as previously touched upon in the cult kissing scene, is on greater display much later in the Simone path. If the player chooses to kiss Simone at one point, Gray and Simone decide to start having sex in the restroom of a restaurant. While this in and of itself could be considered a one-off act of impulsivity, I want to highlight how, during the act of sex, Gray says to Simone, "I love you." Simone becomes quiet for a moment after hearing these words, and then says they should stop having sex. After internally recognizing how there is, quote, "no excuse," end quote, for hooking up in the bathroom, Gray proceeds to apologize for saying he loves Simone. To this, Simone says what made her want to stop having sex was the lack of a condom. It's here when the reader learns that Simone had gotten pregnant at one point with Gray's child. However, cross-species pregnancy always results in a stillbirth, and the pair's unborn child was no exception. While he does care for Simone, Gray, unfortunately, like in his other relationships, falls into the trappings of impulsivity. Whether with Etienne, Simone, or any other romantic partner, Gray seems to often lose perspective on his own goals or values in the heat of a moment. Gray himself seems to be aware of this, and appears to experience a significant amount of shame for such patterns occurring in his own romantic relationships. Near the end of the Jesse and Colt path in Ken's route, Gray proceeds to get drunk with both Jesse and Colt. Gray first begins speaking about how he never thought a romantic relationship involving three people could ever work. He then describes his own thoughts and feelings in regard to his relationship history with both Simone and Etienne. Somewhere deep down, I had hoped we could all get along, that they had secretly been pining for each other as well, and that we'd all be able to work things out. I ended up being unfaithful. I couldn't control myself when I was around him, even though I genuinely loved my girlfriend. Even after ending up with the guy, it didn't work out. I ruined a good relationship just to end up in a shitty one, and then I was alone. Not only did I lose out on love, but I damaged those friendships forever. Yeah. I felt greedy, you know? Being attracted to both men and women made things difficult enough. It started to feel like my curiosity would make it impossible to stay faithful in any relationship. That's why, when I ended up kissing Colt a few nights ago, I felt like I'd gone and ruined things again. Not only has Gray's patterns of impulsivity and self-blame harmed his romantic relationships, but such patterns continue to instill within him feelings of distress. The regret he feels is prominently displayed here, and can even be seen in other routes, such as in the Simone path during Mark's route. Such blame is exacerbated by the disdain he occasionally feels for his own sexual orientation, as demonstrated by his usage of the word greedy in this scene, which is reminiscent of how he described his own sexuality in Mark's route. Because of the choices he has made in regard to his own romantic relationships, Gray's other issues are becoming increasingly more painful, and, as a result, his emotions have become overwhelming. It was a simple email this morning, but I feel like I'm dying. There's a sense of helplessness filling my body, my limbs, my stomach, my skull. A tension fills them that I can't properly explain. I feel afraid. I feel anger. I feel hopeless. I feel tension in the meat that surrounds my bones. Air is filling my skull. I would like nothing more than to get fucked up, turn on my AC, and get under the blankets. But I know that wouldn't solve anything. Things would still need to get done. These emotions would still be here. I would still be me. Upon examining the language utilized by Gray when he reflects upon his own character and behavior, we see that the possum doesn't maintain a positive opinion of himself. In fact, there are moments where Gray's own self-talk becomes downright dismissive and even self-hating on certain occasions. One example of this can be seen in Mark's route, when Mark is getting ready to leave for work. Gray expresses a desire to help around the apartment while Mark is gone, only his thoughts go a step beyond simply wanting to be a helpful guest. Judgment and animosity are seemingly both present, as Gray thinks to himself, quote, "Any way I can be useful, really. I don't want to be a leech," end quote. A much more prolonged and detailed demonstration of such low self-esteem is on display during the Jesse and Colt path in Ken's route. While laying in bed after the previously mentioned strip poker game, Gray thinks to himself how this situation seems too good to be true. Gray thinks to himself, quote, "Life is cruel, isn't it? I'm a bad person, right? So why do I get to experience something as lovely as Colt sleeping in my arms, as comforting as Jesse holding me tight? Is it really okay for me to be happy here?" End quote. It is also worth noting that there is a social component to Gray's low self-esteem, as he often blames himself for the distress of others. Such a belief appears to have contributed to his suicide attempt, but is also currently influencing how Gray behaves in his relationships with each of the route characters. One explicit example of this comes later in Mark's route. For context, Gray has learned of Mark's incestuous dynamic with his brother, Joshua. However, despite being repulsed by this, and being aware that Mark is trying to recreate such a dynamic with him, Gray allows Mark to perform oral sex on him inside a broken elevator. During this scene, Gray thinks to himself, quote, "Yes, this is important. I can't stop him. I won't stop him. Just grin and bear it. Whatever their relationship was, it must have been unhealthy. I can fill the role better. I'll let him call me whatever he needs to. Use my body down to the last drop. Finally, I can be of use to someone." End quote. As a result of such self-hatred, and his frequent feelings of self-blame, Gray often turns to his social relationships. Specifically, Gray often attempts to either secure comfort from or the confirmation of such emotions' validity within his social relationships. In regard to Gray using his social relationships to assuage feelings of insecurity, we must first turn to Hero's route. I will be going into more detail regarding this scene shortly, but, for now, let's focus on the broad strokes of the pair's interactions here. Maybe that wasn't the best way to phrase that. After an emotional moment when Hero is vulnerable with Gray, arguably more vulnerable than he has ever been with anyone else who is currently in his life, Hero and Gray have sex if the player decides to do so. Hero appears satisfied, as he explicitly states that this was one of the best sexual experiences of his life after the pair have finished. However, the following day, Gray requests reassurance that this sexual encounter was in fact enjoyable for Hero, despite the Fennec's previous statements. He specifically verbalizes a fear that Hero was simply flattering him, which is the reason why he is requesting reassurance from the Fennec. Now, let us examine how Gray utilizes his social relationships to reinforce his own feelings of blame and self-hatred. Very late into Mark's route, Gray and Mark drive upstate and away from New York City. The pair are tense here, as the two have had a nightmarish week and been in physical danger on more than one occasion due to Virgil's game. Gray reflects upon the previous days, as well as how stressed and frustrated Mark is with the situation. We then see Gray's self-blame be fully on display, as Gray attempts to apologize to Mark. Gray then internally thinks to himself, quote, "He blames me. He hates me. I'm burdening him. And now he's responsible for cleaning up my mess. It takes all of my self-control not to open the door and leap into oncoming traffic. It's painful just to exist." End quote. Now, it's important to note that Mark actively dissuades this line of thinking, even encouraging Gray not to sacrifice himself for Mark's own benefit. Mark goes so far as to say he doesn't want Gray to die for him. However, despite this, Gray's self-disregard persists. Pertaining to the idea of dying for Mark, Gray even goes so far as to say, quote, "Isn't that what you're supposed to do for someone you care about?" End quote. With this example of using social relationships to validate feelings of self-blame in mind, it's easy to understand why Gray planned on committing suicide during the game's opening scene. He often views himself as a bad person, and utilizes his relationships to verify this belief. Focusing on the distressing aspects of his relationships, both ones that are true and ones that Gray falsely perceives, is why Gray often feels he doesn't deserve to feel happiness. Throughout the routes, we can see that such beliefs still persist, even though Gray expresses regret for his plan to commit suicide. This, to me, demonstrates that such feelings of self-blame aren't going away anytime soon. More importantly, if such emotions are not addressed, they will likely continue to disrupt Gray's attempts at having enjoyable platonic and romantic relationships. There is also a physical component to Gray's low self-esteem that I wish to briefly touch upon. After all, having a low opinion of oneself doesn't exclusively impact us in a psychological manner. In fact, it can often harm us in physical ways. Early on in Mark's route, Mark goes to shower, and Gray remains on the couch. If the player chooses for Gray to attempt to quickly masturbate while Mark is bathing, we see that Gray internally thinks to himself, quote, "I'd been depressed for so long. I couldn't even get hard when I wanted to. I can finally feel myself coming back to life. My senses returning." End quote. I highlight this because, again, Conditions such as low self-esteem and depression do have negative physical side effects. If such conditions aren't effectively managed, it's likely that someone can experience things such as a decrease in libido, an inability to maintain an erection, or even difficulty with achieving an orgasm. Gray's own depression-oriented sexual dysfunction manifests again the following day while cleaning Mark's apartment. For several moments, Gray maintains an erection, expressing feelings of gratitude for being able to do so consistently, as he has been unable to do so for quite some time due to his depressed mood. However, Gray begins to ruminate in regard to his recent suicide attempt, resulting in his erection ultimately subsiding. Gray's low self-esteem and self-blame are harming not just his mental health, but his physical health and social relationships as well. He wants to have satisfying personal relationships, but his poor self-image and the belief he is a burden often hinder his ability to connect with others. If Gray is to reach a place where he can have the intimacy he desires, a lot of changes will need to occur in regard to how he views himself, both as a romantic partner and an individual. Returning to the opening of the game, we learn of Gray's primary coping skill while he sits in Virgil's bar. At one point, Virgil asks Gray what his preferred method of self-destruction is. The player is given 3 options as potential answers. However, only one of these 3 options progresses the story, indicating that it is the only true answer. The true choice is running away. This indicates that Gray often engages in what's known as avoidant behavior. Now, it's important to note that coping skills aren't always healthy. There are coping skills that can, in the long term, exacerbate someone's own mental health issues. Examples of such coping skills include, but are certainly not limited to, behaviors such as substance abuse or self-harm. Focusing on this running away option, we hear Gray explicitly describe how he has used avoidance to cope with the distress in his life, and is currently engaging in avoidance now by attempting to flee from his problems by committing suicide. The scene is as follows. I guess I just don't want to deal with my problems anymore. Look, you really don't know me, mister. I'm not a good man. I tried to do what was expected of me. I tried to go against everything I was taught to believe, and in the end, I sided with the wrong people. I left the ones who really cared for me behind to fucking rot. So then I thought, oh, I can just come back to them as if no time had passed and everything will be all hunky-dory. Fat lot that did. I got shamed, rejected, used, messed up the only good relationship I ever had. Nothing ever felt the same after that. When you completely destroy a person, build up their confidence and then just break them down at their most vulnerable. And you have to live with that, knowing why they never shine quite as brightly as they used to. All because of an impulsive decision you made. So what am I left with? Simone looks at me like a fragile little egg that could break at any moment. Her eyes are always so tired. Sean only sees me as a tenant. Lord knows he's given me more chances than most. At least that apartment will be in better hands now. And Etienne? He just sees me as a punching bag who keeps letting him stick his... Avoidant behavior is what I like to call a quick fix. It can provide instant relief to whatever feelings of anxiety or sadness we are currently experiencing. However, doing so often creates long-term issues. Avoidance often exacerbates our overall emotional distress and potentially creates social conflict if the current situation involves others. This idea is supported during a scene in Ken's route when Gray and his landlord, John, have a private conversation. While alone, John begins lecturing Gray and reminding him of how much his avoidance hurt Simone in the past. Jean says things such as, "You ran away, again," and, "Don't you remember what she said? That's what hurt the most," end quote. Gray himself appears to be aware of the social consequences of avoidant behavior, as shown by another conversation between him and Ken. While discussing past mistakes, Gray says that forgetting one's mistakes causes them to repeat the same error time and time again. Ken says everyone is running from something. This causes Gray to say, quote, "I want to stop running," end quote. Gray often relies on others for support while he navigates difficult situations and, at times, his own emotional distress. Now, while one could argue he is over-reliant on others at times, I feel that the utilization of social support shouldn't entirely be considered unhealthy. Friends, family members, and romantic partners can all have a positive impact on our daily lives. Ideally, such relationships should add to our lives, but not necessarily be our entire lives. We tend to thrive when we know that there are people in our lives who care for us and respect us as individuals, and Gray is no exception. One example of this can be seen later in Gabe's route, where Gray can choose to verbalize his current emotions and thoughts to either Gabe or Etienne. While Etienne and Gray may have a painful history together, Gabe is unconscious, rendering him unable to provide Gray with any comforting words. In my opinion, choosing Gabe here is the healthy option. Gray is able to express himself, to have some kind of catharsis from his distress, and, because Gabe is unconscious, it forces Gray to become self-reliant. He is able to verbalize his emotions, while at the same time take ownership of his own emotions and thoughts, as opposed to relying on someone to resolve or reduce such items for him. This opinion of mine even seems to be shared by Etienne, as shown by his first few lines of dialogue if the player seeks comfort from the Doberman. Specifically, Etienne says that Gray shouldn't rely on others to fix all of his problems. This expectation that others will save Gray even instills within Etienne feelings of anger. Etienne, at one point, even says, quote, "Everyone has problems, but the help needs to be mutual. The pain won't go away, but we can mitigate the suffering," end quote. But is Gray capable of this? Can he engage in such a healthy mutual dynamic and support others in return? I strongly believe so. My reasoning for this comes from the previously mentioned scene far into Hero's route. Now, I feel that it's important to note that Gray internally makes a commitment to protecting Hero and being strong for him prior to this scene. While recognizing that Hero is stronger and smarter, Gray feels the need to protect the Finnick, whose physical health is in a sensitive state due to both blood loss and a recent surgery. Support can come in many forms, and it's important not to discount the effectiveness of kind words or even open ears. I often remind clients that, sometimes, being a good friend or partner is simply being someone who can be vented to. So this commitment to support Hero, while recognizing Hero's own strengths, is a step in the right direction. However, Gray becomes much more than just a person for Hero to vent to. For context, Hero is a trans man, an identity he has kept secret and gone to great lengths to keep hidden. Hero even reveals that he has resorted to scrubbing his genitals with rubbing alcohol in an effort to hide his pheromones. The scene I wish to now highlight involves Gray and Hero at a hot spring together, one that Hero discovered and has told nobody about. Hero first asks Gray to cover his eyes, wanting to get into the water without the possum seeing him naked. Even after Gray is allowed to remove his blindfold and join the finnick in the water, Hero seems tense. He holds his chest, and his eyes glance around. At one point, he even begins shaking and holding his tail. Eventually, Hero begins crying, and ultimately reveals his identity as a trans man. During the moments leading up to this reveal, Gray offers a significant amount of sympathy and support. He even becomes quiet, offering Hero a chance to process his emotions and cry. Gray narrates this moment, saying, quote, "I give him the time he needs. He tries to speak a few times, but chokes on his tears." End quote. Eventually, Gray even goes as far as to say, "I see you, Hero," after Hero's confession. The player is then given a choice, where they can either offer Hero platonic friendship or an intimate relationship. If the player chooses intimacy, Hero expresses concerns about the source of Gray's interest in him. He seems to fear Gray is only showing such support due to viewing Hero's trans identity as a curiosity. Gray assures Hero that this support isn't due to any kind of morbid curiosity, and says, quote, "I want to do it because it's you, Hero." End quote. Gray then, seemingly in an effort to be genuine and even vulnerable with Hero, reveals how he enjoys being sexually submissive, so much so that Simone used to refer to him as a service animal. Gray then requests that Hero perform a dominant role during their sexual encounter, but also states that he only desires this if Hero enthusiastically consents. Gray's ability to offer support as a partner is further on display when Hero explicitly states that he doesn't desire to experience sexual penetration at this time. Gray agrees without hesitation, much to Hero's surprise. As demonstrated by this scene, we are able to see that Gray is capable of showing kindness to his potential partner, and that he is capable of having an open dialogue. He treats Hero's vulnerability with respect here, and even becomes vulnerable himself. Another example of Gray's ability to be a supportive partner comes later in the route, when a drunken Hero and Gray return from the pub and begin having sex. Unlike the hot spring scene, Gray isn't exclusively performing oral sex on Hero here. Due to the newness of this experience within the pair's dynamic, Gray asks Hero to let him know if he's squeezing the finnick too tightly, and, at one point, as the sexual encounter proceeds to escalate, Gray asks for permission to touch Hero's genitals. Hero says he's glad Gray asked, and the two speak for a brief time, shortly before Gray asks if he can resume having sex with Hero. Now, while I've been primarily focusing on his sexual interactions with Hero, Gray's capabilities of offering support aren't limited to sexual intimacy. Circling back to the hot spring scene, if the player chooses to pursue a platonic relationship with Hero, Gray still commends Hero's courage for coming out to him. Hero's insecurities still present themselves, and he expresses a belief that Gray isn't interested in a sexual relationship with him because of Hero's trans identity. Gray, much like in the other path, comforts Hiro and assures him that he isn't bothered by Hiro's identity. He then says, quote, "You're more than just your body. You're Hiro," end quote. It is also worth noting that, in both the platonic and sexual paths here in this scene, Gray expresses a desire to help Hiro find better ways of hiding his Vulpin pheromones that don't involve rubbing alcohol. Now, focusing a little bit more on the topic of communication and the Hiro route, I also wish to highlight a scene that takes place much later. For context, Gray and Hiro have been performing various odd jobs around town in an effort to receive some money. During one of his jobs, Gray is surprised by a sexual encounter in the communal showers, an incident Hiro appears to have expected to occur when he volunteered Gray for the shower job. When Hiro initially decides to inquire about this sexual experience, he appears to assume Gray only manually stimulated the other men with his hands, something that Hiro himself has done previously. Gray honestly states that this isn't true, revealing that he performed a rim job on one man. Hiro appears to become upset and proceeds to curl up in a ball. His speech becomes filled with pauses, and he admits that he never kissed any of these men before during his sexual encounters at the showers. Unfortunately, despite Hiro's apparent insecurities, Gray doesn't initially take accountability for his behavior during this encounter at the showers. He makes multiple insensitive statements to an upset Hiro in this moment, such as, quote, "You didn't give me any limitations, man," and "You knew that they'd come on to me, and didn't even warn me," end quote. Such statements, understandably, seem to further upset Hiro, who remains silent for some time. However, Gray seems to realize he is upsetting Hiro, and is able to adjust his approach into a more supportive one. Gray proceeds to rub Hiro's back, and listen to Hiro verbalize why Gray's sexual encounter upset him. Hiro then requests that Gray ask for permission in the future if Gray decides to sexually engage these two men. To this, Gray agrees without hesitation. He then offers Hiro both a hug and a kiss, just before proposing that the two of them seek out a sexual encounter at the communal showers together as an exciting compromise. While Gray wasn't initially communicating in an ideal manner at the beginning of this scene, he does become more receptive and supportive as the conversation continues. This is due to the fact that him becoming aware of how ineffective and even upsetting his initial approach is, causing him to adjust accordingly. This scene, as well as others in this section of the video, demonstrates how Gray's relationships play a significant role in how he navigates his daily life. He occasionally seeks comfort from those around him to a degree that can be considered overly dependent, and, while he may make mistakes during times of heightened emotions, Gray is capable of providing mutual support within his relationships. Our friends and romantic partners can improve our overall life satisfaction. However, it is necessary to provide support to such individuals in return. Doing so not only emphasizes our care for one another, but also causes the relationships to strengthen as a whole. The first issue I would want to address as Gray's clinician is his plan to commit suicide. Much like in my Mark video, I would utilize this chart to explore Gray's current suicidality. I would do this despite Gray seemingly no longer wanting to commit suicide after his initial suicide attempt was prevented. The recency of his suicide plan is still cause for concern, and, as it is a matter of life and death, I would not want to operate under the assumption that Gray's suicidality has dissipated. Through the utilization of this checklist, we can see that Gray checks multiple boxes, including ones that indicate him to be a high-risk client regarding suicide. These results would compel me, as a clinician, to explicitly ask whether or not Gray still desires to attempt suicide. If Gray said yes, then I, as a mandated reporter, would be compelled to call the authorities, which would then result in Gray being hospitalized for a short period of time. Now, if Gray affirms he isn't going to attempt suicide again, I would proceed to take 2 courses of action in regard to his treatment. Firstly, I would discuss the topic of psychiatric medication with Gray, and explore whether or not he is interested in obtaining medication for depression. Doing so could be imperative given Gray's recent plans involving suicide. Medication may also potentially aid the possum as he progresses further into treatment and begins attempting to complete more challenging psychological work on himself. While psychiatric medication isn't a fix-all solution, it can help stabilize someone and get them to a psychological state where they can address their own issues more effectively. Secondly, I feel that, much like in my Mark video, it would be imperative to create a safety plan with Gray. For those who don't know, a safety plan is an agreement where the client agrees to a list of behaviors to engage in when experiencing suicidality. This list is formed together through collaboration between the clinician and client. In addition to listing behaviors to perform when feeling suicidal, the agreement acts as a reminder. Specifically, a safety plan can remind a client of certain warning signs that they are gradually becoming more and more at risk for suicidality. And, if a client is monitoring themselves for such warning signs, they can preemptively respond in a healthy manner before their distress becomes overwhelming and more difficult to manage. Based on Gray's behavior throughout the 4 routes of Burrows, warning signs I would want to list here are feelings of hopelessness and self-blame, drinking alcohol, ruminating in regard to Sam, and thoughts of death and/or suicide. Such warning signs are present throughout the routes, but, more importantly, they all culminate together during the game's prologue when Gray is planning on committing suicide, indicating to me that such items are accurate indicators when it comes to evaluating Gray's own risk of committing suicide. I would also wish to assist Gray in identifying people he can rely on if he seriously begins contemplating suicide again. Despite Gray's complicated and even somewhat distressing personal histories with them, I believe both Etienne and Simone should be identified here. I believe this for 2 reasons. 1. At the beginning of Hero's route, Gray contemplates both of these 2 individuals and becomes adamant about being able to return to them. Gray even goes as far as to say, quote, "I'll apologize 1,000,000 times. I'll do anything it takes. Even if they never want to see my face again, I'm coming back," end quote. My second reason for listing Simone and Etienne here is due to a previously described scene in Mark's route when Gray and Simone discuss Gray's suicide attempt. During this conversation, Gray himself states that he didn't see Simone perform the night he planned on committing suicide, as he feared doing so would likely have resulted in him abandoning his plan altogether. While I do want to encourage Gray to become more self-reliant, the impact of Etienne and Simone's friendships have on him is undeniable. Overlooking these 2 as potential sources of support would be an oversight, in my opinion. They have not only given Gray a place to live, but they have also given him a great deal of emotional comfort. Having people we can turn to in our lives is a wonderful thing. They can give us comforting words, or even just listen to what is troubling us. While I believe Gray would experience feelings of self-blame as he attempts to continue using his friends for support, albeit in a more healthy manner than before, I would try to show him that they are not the only people he can rely on. There are others in this world who have gone through the same psychological issues we have, people that possess personal insight into our own individual struggles. This includes, but is certainly not limited to, the issue of addiction. Given Gray's relapse during the game's prologue, and the routes in which Gray continues to consume alcohol, I feel it is important to address his relationship with the substance. After all, alcohol has harmed his physical health and disrupted his attempts at maintaining personal relationships. Firstly, I would explore medication as a potential option for Gray here. I mention this primarily due to the prescription of morphine his psychiatrist gave him in the extra short story for alcohol withdrawal. I would ask whether or not the morphine was helpful for Gray, and then explore potential medication options to discuss with a psychiatrist or primary care physician, such as the medication naltrexone. As I said in regard to the depression medication, medications such as naltrexone won't entirely resolve an individual's issues with alcohol, but it can make it easier to manage. Naltrexone in particular can diminish the pleasurable aspects of consuming alcohol, making an individual less inclined to consume the drug, and, ideally, significantly reduce their overall intake of it. Secondly, I believe exploring the possibility of attending support groups pertaining to alcohol abuse would be a conversation worth having with Gray. After all, Gray, like many people, finds comfort in his relationships with others. And so, I would want to discuss certain support groups, such as Alcoholics Anonymous and Smart Recovery, with him. Now, for those of you who are unaware, Alcoholics Anonymous is a 12-step program that encourages peer support. I highlight the last portion of that sentence because, currently, Gray doesn't have an effective social support network when it comes to maintaining his sobriety. The current people in his life don't have an understanding of what it's like to struggle with addiction. And the few people who do, such as Cult, appear to be negatively impacting Gray's abstinence from alcohol. I believe that having a more informed and understanding group of people in his life regarding addiction would greatly assist Gray. I also believe the possibility of attending weekly group meetings would give Gray a sense of structure in his life, which appears to be lacking due to his inconsistent jobs. There are also AA meetings that take place every day, which Gray could attend if he is facing a particularly challenging day and is struggling to remain sober. Now, I also feel it is necessary to mention Smart Recovery as a potential alternative to AA. For those who are unaware, Smart Recovery is not a 12-step program, and, unlike Alcoholics Anonymous, does not have a basis in spirituality. It utilizes certain therapeutic models, such as REBT and CBT. I emphasize this because, for some people, a spiritual component may be a deterrent in regard to them utilizing an organization, such as AA. I believe that Gray himself would be one of these people, given that, in Hero's Route, he refers to himself as a, quote, long-time apostate, end quote. Even before the routes diverge, Gray has a conversation with Mark in the Golden Place that seems to indicate there is lingering pain from his own religious experiences. Gray specifically says to Mark that he expected his afterlife to be more, quote, fire and brimstone, end quote. Such a statement causes me to believe that Gray has faced a great deal of religious-oriented shame in his life. Because of this, I believe it would be important to mention Smart Recovery in particular as an option to Gray. I believe that this particular group would offer him a social support network that has insight into addiction, and would not potentially hinder Gray's efforts at abstinence due to a lack of spiritual undertones. Again, I feel the need to emphasize both AA and Smart Recovery due to the social aspects of such groups. It can be very helpful and affirming to speak with others who can relate to your own personal struggles. There are also opportunities to support one another, which I would emphasize with Gray. I would do so in an effort to help Gray recognize his own capabilities of offering support and aid him in understanding that he doesn't have to rely on others to solve all of his issues. There can be a sense of community to be found in such groups. I use that word community due to a conversation Gray has with Etienne during the previously mentioned Mardi Gras extra short story. Near the end of the short story, Etienne and Gray sit on a bench while others swarm the streets for Mardi Gras. It's here when Gray says, quote, "I've never taken part in any sort of community. It's a living, breathing thing. Being a neighbor to someone, or even just living with a roommate, it branches off into so many other relationships. Then I have to try and figure out how to act around all of these new people, and then how to act like I'm not acting," end quote. Gray clearly desires to have this sense of community, a social setting where he feels he can belong. This point is further emphasized during the end of the short story. Despite some initial discomfort in joining the crowd of Mardi Gras celebrators along with Etienne and Simone, there's a noticeable shift in Gray's mood. He no longer feels hopeless or even nervous. Instead, he's smiling and internally says, quote, "Sitting on top of Et's shoulders feels like I'm on top of the world. For a brief moment, it actually feels like I belong here," end quote. Now, in regard to Gray increasing his own self-reliance, I believe it would be worthwhile to explore the topic of addictive voice recognition technique with the possum. As the name suggests, this technique aims at both identifying certain statements we often use when tempted to abuse substances, and reframing such sentiments in a manner that makes us less likely to internalize them. To demonstrate how addictive voice recognition technique can be utilized, let us examine a scene in Ken's route. Gray and Colt are sitting together at a bar, beginning to speak after ordering drinks. Colt expresses concern, as Gray has admitted to previously having issues with alcohol. To such concerns, Gray says, quote, "After all the bullshit we've been through, I think I've earned one cocktail," end quote. In utilizing addictive voice recognition technique, I would assist Gray in identifying reoccurring thoughts he experiences similar to this, ones that encourage consuming alcohol through justification. Now, another important component of addictive voice recognition technique is distancing yourself from this addictive voice. This typically involves otherizing such justification thoughts. You, for a lack of a better term, detach yourself from such thoughts. People with addiction often struggle with self-blame, which, more often than not, makes it difficult not to relapse. And so, reminding yourself that such justifying thoughts are just thoughts that do not reflect your own character can help prevent a relapse. If Gray were to utilize the addictive voice recognition technique in the scene with Colt, Gray could reframe his justifying thought by thinking to himself, "The voice is telling me to drink right now, but drinking right now will make me feel worse, and I will be proud of myself later for remaining sober." It is also worth noting that some people find addictive voice recognition technique to be more effective when imagining that the voice belongs to someone they dislike. Essentially, you imagine someone you dislike attempting to pressure you to drink, which can diminish your overall inclination to relapse. I believe that if Gray were to imagine his own father as the owner of his addictive voice, Gray would become less inclined to drink alcohol. I believe this due to an incident in Gabe's route when Gray stops himself from using a slur, despite being tempted to do so. He does so due to believing that the usage of such language would make his father proud. Again, by assisting Gray in utilizing the addictive voice recognition technique during therapy sessions, I would hope to encourage Gray to become more self-reliant, and even confident in his own strengths as an individual. He has gone several years without drinking prior to his encounter with Virgil, and, I believe, he is capable of doing so once more. Whether or not Gray pursues medication, AA, or smart recovery is entirely up to him. However, I wish to explore all of these options with him, as everyone's path to sobriety is not identical. Some people rely on medication, while others find that individual therapy alone is enough for them to remain sober. But, through discussing these options and what they would entail, I would hope to assist Gray in making an informed decision regarding his own sobriety. And, once he has obtained a consistent state of sobriety, I would want to work with him to maintain it and re-emphasize whatever tools he has effectively used up until that point. I would even highlight any differences I see in Gray's overall mental state after he has achieved sobriety in an effort to encourage him to maintain this behavior. At the time of recording, I have gone 1,079 days without drinking alcohol. In all my years of drinking, and among countless nights I can only remember wisps of, I never thought I would be able to say that. And sure, there are days when I'm tempted to drink again, to decompress after a long day of work, or to enjoy time with friends with more vigor. But I remind myself that work, my relationships, and life have all become so much easier because of this improvement. I'm sober now, and it feels as though the universe has given me a second chance. And I hope that one day, Gray can feel such feelings of content in his own sobriety journey. Gray, like many people, often falls into the trappings of overgeneralization. Such a way of thinking can impact how we view ourselves, as well as the world as a whole. The American Psychological Association defines overgeneralization as, quote, a cognitive distortion in which an individual views a single event as an invariable rule, so that, for example, failure at accomplishing one task will predict an endless pattern of defeat in all tasks, end quote. Now, in an effort to provide a clear example of overgeneralization, let's say a friendship of yours ended abruptly. In this example, you ignore the details of why the friendship terminated, possibly even ignoring the fact that you have other friends. You think to yourself statements such as, "Everyone abandons me," or "I will never have another friendship as enjoyable." In short, overgeneralization is when we make broad and negative generalizations about the future, our relationships, or even ourselves. A prominent example of Gray engaging in such thought patterns can be seen well into Gabe's route. Gabe, for context, is upset in this scene due to a disagreement with his friends, who earlier ignored Gabe's concerns with a plan of entering a supposedly haunted house. Gray agrees that this is the best course of action, much to Gabe's dismay. It's also worth mentioning that shortly before this, Gabe became upset at one friend accusing him of cheating at D&D, while another friend insulted Gabe's own intelligence. As you can imagine, Gabe is very distressed in this moment, and Gray is contemplating how best to address this situation. This leads to Gray internally thinking, quote, "Didn't anyone teach him that kindness is a weakness? That there's no reward for altruism or good intentions in this world?" End quote. This is a very broad and bleak perspective on both kindness and the world as a whole. Gray himself seems to be aware of this, as he then proceeds to think to himself, quote, "I always have the worst outlook on everything, huh?" End quote. Now, it would be one thing to maintain a certain philosophical outlook on the universe, but there's more to Gray's own psyche here than simply subscribing to a certain philosophical point of view. This tendency to broadly assume the worst possible outcomes is negatively impacting Gray's relationships. After all, this type of thinking is frequently aimed at Gray himself and his interactions with others. We know this because in Gray's suicide note to his friends, Gray writes, quote, "I've been a terrible friend to you all. I've been nothing but a burden since I arrived back in town, and complicated your already difficult lives." End quote. In my work with Gray, I would want to assist him in developing more flexible ways of thinking. Yes, sometimes the worst case scenario does occur, so it is wise to be prepared. However, when we always anticipate it to occur in every situation or relationship we find ourselves in, it takes a toll on all areas of our lives. And so, I would initially go about first challenging such overgeneralizations in Gray's thinking with the help of Socratic questioning. Since it is the most recently discussed example, let's challenge the "I've been a terrible friend to you all" thought that can be found in Gray's suicide note. Firstly, is there any evidence in support of this thought? Gray appears to believe so, often citing two reasons that support this. The two reasons specifically are his difficulties in financially contributing to the residence he shares with Simone, as well as his infidelity with Etienne. Now, is there any evidence that contradicts this idea of Gray being a terrible friend? Focusing on Simone and Etienne for a moment, Gray can be seen attempting to pull his own weight in the Mardi Gras short story. Despite difficulties with obtaining a consistent source of income, Gray has still worked odd jobs around New Orleans, all in an effort to assist his friends in paying rent and buying food. If Gray truly were a terrible friend, as he fears himself to be, why would he go through all of the trouble working odd jobs so that he can pay rent with his friends? More importantly, why would he feel so guilty and apologize to Etienne if he were in fact this terrible friend that he fears himself to be? Continuing to still focus on Etienne and Simone, I would like to address the portion of this worksheet that asks, how might others interpret the same situation differently? Near the beginning of the Mardi Gras story, Gray expresses how he's still trying to find consistent work, and appears to feel guilty for how hard both Etienne and Simone are working. To this, Etienne says, quote, "Can you please stop trying to pay us back? We already agreed to take you in. We knew what we were getting into." End quote. I highlight this because it directly contradicts what Gray himself believes regarding his own friendships with Simone and Etienne. Yes, both of them are working hard so that they can pay rent, but the pair made an informed decision to help Gray in his time of need. Such a sentiment shows care for Gray. Care that also appears to be present when both Etienne and Simone go looking for Gray after finding his suicide note. I would now like to address the topic of Sam's suicide, which appears to be playing a role in regard to the overgeneralizations Gray makes about himself. During the extra short story, The Path, Gray opens up about his relationship with Sam and Sam's suicide. However, one of the first statements Gray makes to the psychiatrist regarding Sam at the beginning of the short story is, quote, "He's, was my best friend. At least that's how he saw it. I was a pretty terrible friend to him, looking back." End quote. I would like to focus on what I perceive to be self-blame on Gray's part regarding Sam's death. He seems to view himself as a terrible friend, in part due to the events surrounding Sam's death. In fact, this belief of being a terrible friend appears to have first begun with the death of Sam all those years ago. And so, with this in mind, I would want to pose a question to Gray. Specifically, I would ask him whether or not this reoccurring belief of him being a terrible friend is a thought that is being experienced out of habit, as opposed to being an accurate reflection of the present moment. I would ask such a question in an effort to reduce whatever self-blame Gray continues to experience due to Sam's death, but also to help Gray feel less distress within his current personal relationships. In regard to being a supposedly terrible friend towards Sam in particular, I would highlight the positives I see in the relationship he had with his childhood friend. I would want to focus on this particular question regarding Gray's friendship with Sam, because the issue of their friendship cannot be simply labeled as healthy or unhealthy. It's much more nuanced, in my opinion, than such definitive labels. Yes, Sam was bullied within the pair's friend group, especially by Charles and Etienne, and, to a certain extent, Gray permitted such bullying to occur. However, Gray at one point punched Etienne for his aggression towards Sam in an attempt to defend his friend. I would also highlight how there were elements outside of Gray's control that contributed to Sam's decision to commit suicide, such as the sexual abuse that Sam witnessed his father perform against Charles. More importantly, I would want to emphasize the fact that, despite rejecting Sam's romantic feelings, Gray did make an effort to comfort his friend. Sam, while proceeding to cry after confessing his romantic feelings for Gray, finds himself being hugged by the possum under the magnolia tree. While Gray says he doesn't share Sam's romantic feelings, he says he's happy Sam told him. He even goes as far as commending Sam for confessing such feelings, despite how difficult doing so must have been. Gray emphasizes that he still wants to have Sam in his life and maintain their friendship. He then does his signature handshake with Sam one last time to affirm his love for his friend. It's easy for anyone to fall into the trappings of overgeneralization, especially when our emotions are overwhelming us. But when we re-examine our thoughts and consistently evaluate them, we can better understand who we are as individuals and how we present ourselves to those around us. And, more importantly, we can effectively change the circumstances of our lives for the better. Finally, I would like to utilize Socratic questioning to aid Gray in his rigid and often judgmental view of his own sexuality. As demonstrated earlier in the video, Gray doesn't have a label for his own sexual orientation, and can be seen referring to himself as greedy for enjoying sexual encounters with both men and women. Regarding this greedy label, I would ask Gray, how might others interpret this situation? While Mark has proven himself to not be the best person to talk about Gray's sexuality, the same cannot be said of Ken. In an effort to both understand and support Ken's own sexual confusion during one scene, Gray shares his perspective on his own identity. In an effort to support Ken, Gray shares that he finds people from all walks of life attractive. Doing so appears to comfort Ken somewhat, as the Panther opens up about his own perceptions and insecurities pertaining to gay people. Ken even proceeds to admit that, due to Gray's own identity, that he wishes to better understand himself and feel more comfortable with his own sexuality. It is also worth noting that Ken experiences sexual attraction to both men and women during his route, which I would remind Gray of during my work with him. Gray isn't alone in the attraction he feels to more than one gender, as Ken himself appears to be neither gay or straight. Taking things a step further, I would also suggest to Gray that being open with his own identity appears to have helped Ken. I would suggest this due to a conversation later in Ken's route, where the Panther says he feels he can be his genuine self around Gray, even going so far as to say that Gray helped him find the words, and thanks the possum for doing so. I would also focus on this in my work with Gray in an effort to, again, emphasize to Gray the importance of providing mutual support within personal relationships. It's healthy, and, more importantly, Gray is capable of doing so, even if it may not always feel like it for him. This scene, as well as the reassurance Hero seemingly feels during the previously described hot spring scene, shows that Gray's sexuality isn't the negative attribute Gray fears it to be sometimes. Gray's sexuality aids him in his attempts to connect with people, such as Hero, and even offer support to people like Ken. I would hope, in my work with him, that I would assist Gray in understanding that his sexual orientation isn't a character flaw. If anything, it's a core part of how Gray experiences the world and his relationships. Finally, on the topic of Gray's sexuality, I would want to explore with him certain labels that he is seemingly unaware of, such as bisexuality, pansexuality, and omnisexuality. Now, similarly to what I stated in my Ken video, it's not my job, nor my intention, to assign Gray a label for his own sexuality. He has to do that for himself. As a clinician, I would only bring labels such as the ones I just listed to his attention, and explore whether or not Gray feels they accurately represent him. In doing so, I would be attempting to further normalize Gray's sexuality, and help him understand that it's a beautiful thing, not a detriment. There are still days when I struggle with my own thoughts, especially in regard to my own character and future. There are times where I get out of bed feeling hopeless, and return to bed still feeling that way. But, because I used antidepressants for a brief period of time, and continue to attend my own individual therapy, these days are much less common than they used to be. I've not only learned who I am as an individual, but I've also learned to accept myself. I now understand that accepting myself doesn't mean I'm a narcissist, as I often feared it did in the past. It means just that, acceptance. That alone has changed my world. I know I'm not a liar when it comes to my own bisexuality. The fact that I learned something new about my sexuality at this point in my life simply shows just how difficult it can be to understand one's own self. Such an experience is not a reflection of my own character, as I often feared it to be. Living in this world means having your own difficulties, but it's important to remind yourself that the presence of difficulties isn't inherently a reflection of your own worth. I'm happier now. Happier than I have ever been in my entire life. I can honestly say I'm glad to be alive. And, more importantly, I'm glad to be me. After returning from a job in Hero's Route, we see Gray reflect on his overall motivations in his own life. He specifically thinks to himself, quote, "Have I ever had something I cared about enough to risk my own life for? When was the last time I even dreamt about my future? God, I've been living one day at a time for so long, I think I forgot what it's even like to dream. Maybe I'm just naive about what it means to have a fulfilling life." End quote. Currently, Gray seems to be uncertain about his own values. Because of this, I would utilize items seen on this chart that pertain to some common values that motivate people in their day-to-day life in my work with Gray. Because of the frequency in which Gray contemplates his own social relationships, employment, and alcohol abuse, I believe, for Gray, it would be effective to rank social relations, employment, and health very highly in regard to importance via this chart. In regard to the employment value, I would explore what Gray's ideal career would look like. I would do so by asking him questions such as, what personal qualities do you want to bring to your work? And what skills do you want to develop? On the topic of social relationships, I would ask Gray questions, including, but certainly not limited to, what sort of relationships do you want to build? And how do you want to be in these relationships? Finally, in regard to his physical health, I would ask Gray questions such as, what does being physically healthy mean to you? And what would an ideal replacement for drinking alcohol be? While answering these questions alone may not bring Gray the happiness he clearly desires, they can give Gray a sense of direction regarding his personal and professional future. He grew up in a household where he was told what to do, and even who to marry. And now, he's living in a world where he is attempting to learn what he wants. He gets to be his own person and choose, but choosing comes with uncertainty and, occasionally, painful emotions such as stress and sadness. Emotions like these can make it difficult to make decisions and even cause someone to return back to unhealthy situations, all because such situations are familiar. And so, in addition to assisting Gray in defining his own personal values and goals, I would want to explore with him the manner in which his avoidant behavior has prevented him from developing a more purposeful and satisfying life. I would do so by first defining what Gray has referred to as running away. Avoidant behavior, to give a definition, can be described as, quote, any act or series of actions that enables an individual to avoid or anticipate unpleasant or painful situations, stimuli, or events, including conditioned aversive stimuli, end quote. And so, I would use this chart to aid Gray in seeing how avoidance has harmed him. For instance, I would show Gray how the utilization of suicide to escape his current difficulties has resulted in him being endangered by Virgil's game, as well as resulted in Simone and Etienne being put in danger as well. Had Gray chosen a more proactive and direct manner of addressing his current issues, none of these individuals would be in danger. Now, I would clearly state that I'm not attempting to shame Gray by exploring this instance of avoidant behavior. I would state that I'm attempting to emphasize the cost of avoidant behavior. Yes, avoidance can feel nice. The thing causing us worry quickly leaves our attention, and we are no longer thinking about it, especially if sex or alcohol are involved. But choosing avoidance can often come with a high price. Choosing what is new can often be stressful and even frustrating. But, sometimes, you have to endure such emotions for a brief period of time. That is significantly difficult. But, when you have defined personal and professional trajectories, enduring such distress can become somewhat easier. And, in doing so, we can eventually find ourselves leading the kinds of fulfilling lives that we once thought were never possible. I feel now that it's time I address my different approach regarding this video. Whenever I make a video, I always try to be mindful of the fact that I'm talking about real psychological issues that someone watching my content might be struggling with. Because of this, as well as some of the similarities between my own mental health and Gray's, I felt that it might have been potentially beneficial to perform what's known as self-disclosure. While learning to become a therapist, there's a lot of talk that happens around this idea of self-disclosure. Specifically, self-disclosure is the act of revealing personal information about oneself to other people. Some therapists share more than others regarding self-disclosure, and it can vary from client to client. There's a lot of different factors to consider when considering when to self-disclose, many of which revolve around a client's well-being and whether or not the personal information being shared will help, overshadow, or actively harm them. However, if done effectively, it can validate a client, and even encourage them to continue addressing their own issues. That's why I wanted to touch upon some of my own mental health in this video. Depression, suicidal thoughts, addiction are all real issues that aren't rare. They're issues I've struggled with and, to a lesser extent, continue to manage in my own daily life. I still have bad days, but the bad days I experience now are so much less painful than they were before. Had I not worked on myself, I would have missed so much. Experiences, people who have made my life so much brighter. I'm glad I used antidepressants in college. I'm relieved that I was able to get sober. And I'm happy to still be alive. I may not know who you are, or even what you're going through in terms of your own mental health. But I hope that one day you can give yourself a chance. I'm glad I did.
I'm crossing you in style.